Hello. There's something slightly perverse about talking about everything except Eisenstein here, but why not? He gets too much coverage anyway, and that's certainly what people thought in the 20s. So what I thought I would try and do is say a little bit about the landscape of early Soviet cinema in the 20s, and use a few slides to try and sketch that for you. I'm sure different people will know different areas of this already, so I hope this isn't too much repeating things that people already know. And then I thought we'd move on and look at some extracts. It's always difficult juggling between film extracts and slides. So I'm going to do the slides first, and then once you've got a sense of where things are coming from, we'll see how far we get with extracts. Okay. So I put an image from what has become one of the best known films of the 20s in a strange sort of way that is not by Eisenstein, the film Aelita, there because just to really try to draw attention to something which will come up several times in the course of what I'm saying, which is that people think of Aelita as being a film with amazing sets, Cubo-futurist sets, and those are the parts of the film that are normally shown. And that's true. Of course, that's what has made the film so popular. But actually, quite a large part of the film is a real film about 1921 in Moscow. And there is no other film that deals with the sense of everyday life at the end of the Civil War, trains returning, Red Army soldiers being demobbed. Eisenstein was one of those who was being demobbed just around that time. And in that scene, for instance, you have an amazing sort of reconstruction of the period. This film was made in 1924. What they've done is to reconstruct the feel of things in roughly 21 with posters. In many cases, posters that we know because they're part of the kind of canon of great revolutionary Soviet posters, but they've actually put them back on the walls to recreate the feel of what it was like then. So Aelita is many things. I've written a longish piece about it, trying to unpack how many different layers and elements are in it. But it's mainly because of the striking Martian episodes that it's become known. But actually, like a lot of other films from this period, it can tell us much more, is really what I'm trying to say. And here are just some of the elements. This is the still that launched 100 books about the early Soviet period. It's reproduced. It has been reproduced from a very early stage. As soon as people started writing about early Soviet cinema, they started reproducing these amazing stills. You don't get many scenes like that in the film. It looks better as a still than it does in the film in many ways, interestingly. It's one of those things which makes a very striking image. And of course it plays into people's expectations. You know, there's an expectation that early Soviet cinema will have some relationship to constructivist set design in the theatre, images that we know very well, and indeed the actual constructivist artwork of Rodchenko and company. But most of the films do not have any very obvious relationship at all, except for these scenes in Aelita. Now, this is Yakov Protazanov, who is often barely mentioned in discussions of Aelita. But, of course, he is the director of the film, and in many ways he is responsible for bringing together these apparently incompatible elements. And the other thing you can see from this, of course, is that it was a film that got exported. That's an early German poster for it. Now, this is at a time when no Soviet films really were being seen abroad at all. Early Soviet cinema of the Soviet period, let's be more exact, had no export market at all. The only Russian films that were being seen abroad in the very early 20s were mostly documentaries about famine. There was a lot of fundraising activity, and quite a number of films were made about the Volga famine and the various other famines to raise money for famine relief. These were quite widely seen, but the idea of artistic Russian films being seen abroad, absolutely not. Aelita broke the barrier. It was distributed quite widely, Germany, America, and elsewhere, and it was certainly seen before any of the films of Eisenstein or any of the other names that we're familiar with. Protazanov was one of the founders of Russian cinema. He started making films in 1911, 1912. He actually cut his teeth on making one of the Tolstoy films. There are 3 Tolstoy films, and one of them is the film known in English usually as The Departure of the Great Old Man, which is a scandalous shocker which tries to recreate the last days of Tolstoy's life fictionally, when he ran away from home and ended up dying in a railway station. The family, the Tolstoy family, was scandalized by this film and tried to suppress it. They succeeded in suppressing it in Russia, but not abroad. And the film was quite widely seen abroad because, of course, Tolstoy was a world figure. But he went on from that slightly scandalous start to make some of the key films of 1914 and 1915. And along with Gardin and Protazanov were the 2 absolute mainstays, the 2 top directors of the first great era of Russian cinema. They shared between them the filming of all the classics. They filmed War and Peace, Anna Karenina. All of the classics of Russian literature were quickly filmed in 14-15, and Protazanov played quite an important part in that. He went into emigration in 1918 and went to France and then to Germany, and negotiations began in the early 20s to bring him back. This is the period when the fledgling Soviet government was busy thinking about how it could bring back most of the great Russian artists who had left Russia. It's the period of negotiations with Shaliapin and all kinds of people, the musicians who had all left until they could take a view about what had happened. And Protazanov was one of these. He was a major figure in Russian film who had made 5 films in Western Europe, in France and in Germany. So he wasn't doing too badly. He was part of quite a large emigre community in those 2 countries. But the aim was to get him back, because what Soviet-era cinema desperately needed was professional filmmakers. They didn't have any. And a long and complicated negotiation took place involving a writer, Alexei Tolstoy, very distant relation of Leo Tolstoy. Alexei Tolstoy, who was a well-known writer who had gone into emigration, had written a science fiction story called Aelita. And the idea was to bring that together with Protazanov and to film it, to make a science fiction film. To cut a long story short, Protazanov and his 2 scriptwriters took the novel, which is a pretty dopey novel, cut it up and turned it into a kind of satire on cosmic aspirations amongst the Russian intelligentsia. It's a film which shows a bemused figure who is a radio engineer, scientist as it were, who dreams about revolution on Mars. And so the scenes that are set very much in post-Civil War Moscow, full of detail about people being billeted because of the housing shortage, and all sorts of things like that, and the beginnings of the NEP too. All of that is kind of the layer on which the fantasy episodes, the interplanetary revolution episodes, are set. Tolstoy obviously was outraged what had been done to his novel, but ultimately, why should he care? I think he was paid, although we don't know anything about that. But the film was an outrageous success, a huge success. It had a grand premiere. The story goes that Protazanov couldn't get into the premiere of his own film because there were too many people. May or may not be true, who knows. The cinema was all decked out, as cinemas were in those days, dressed thematically, with using some of the wonderful costumes, etc., and designs made for the film, which were done by Isaac Rabinovich, who worked in the Moscow theatre, very considerable set designer who worked for the Yiddish theatre, and the costumes were partly by Alexandra Exter. I think Exter was already in Paris at this time. Somebody else might know the answer. I suspect she was by 24, but I'm not absolutely certain. But somehow the costumes were created by Alexandra Exter, and of course the costumes have become one of the most famous features of the film. Yulia Soltseva, who plays Aelita, the Queen of Mars, is decked out in this wonderful garb with a sort of triple bra and the great spikes coming out of her hair. And the costumes are truly wonderful. The setting is very theatrical. You can see that Rabinovich was essentially a theatre designer, but he produced really a kind of version of the sort of set design that you would have seen in the Kamenny Theatre at that time. The Martian scenes are set in a very stagey but rather wonderful setting. So my argument would be that this is a perfect fusion film. It's a film that manages to fuse the old, because many aspects of it could perfectly well have been made in 1916 or 1915, with the new. And it's the way that these are fitted together in such a way, rather cleverly, with a narrative device that explains that the constructivist, the cubo-futurist bits are Mars, as it were, and the rest is actually a very realistic view of Moscow as it had been recently. The Young Turks of the emerging Soviet cinema absolutely hated Aelita. They thought it was a scandal. They were mortified that that Soviet film authorities wanted to bring back the old guard. If Eisenstein and Vertov certainly had their way, there would have been no bringing back Protazanov. He was absolutely what they were against, and this was not the path that they wanted to see the new Soviet cinema set upon. So right away you've got a kind of conflict set up between the return of the old, represented by Protazanov, and the new Soviet-era cinema that was struggling to emerge. But what is this new Soviet cinema to be, exactly, is the question that sort of hangs over these early years. Well, one very important theme, I suppose, that hangs, there are two themes that sort of hang over it. One is the emerging popular culture of the early 20s, which is a popular culture that kind of mixes elements from American popular culture and general Western European popular culture with distinctively Russian elements. And it's, I think, beautifully summed up in the films that were made of the Miss Mend detective stories. These were sometimes known as Red Pinkertons. They were by a female writer, Maria Shaganin, who went under the pseudonym of Jim Dollar, which made her sound more American. And there were a series of popular books written about, detectives who are solving mysteries. And I'll show you a little bit of Miss Mend later, that you can see it. It's a 3-part film, lasting just over 4 hours. It was hugely popular, and in many ways it absolutely answered what much of the audience was looking for, which was something of the excitement that they would have got from Western detective cliffhanger serials, but in a Russian setting. And this was co-directed by Boris Barnet, who's here. This is him making an appearance in his own film, The House of Trubnaya. And Fyodor Otsep. Otsep was one of the scriptwriters of Aelita. He would go into emigration later. He would actually emigrate and become a Western filmmaker a little later in the decade. But he's another of these crossover figures who had been working in the cinema as a very, very young man indeed before the revolution, as an assistant at in the studio, and then was in part of the team that made Aelita, and then has a short career in early Soviet cinema. And this figure, who I think is tremendously important, Boris Barnet, is really one of the key figures who leads us through to what Soviet popular cinema will become. And I'm going to show you a little later a little bit of Barnet's acting, because he actually acted with the Kuleshov group. He's in The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. He then starts to make a very distinctive kind of comedy. After Miss Mend, he begins to make popular comedies like The House on Trubnaya and The Girl with the Hat Box with Anna Sten. These two films, which were not greeted as masterpieces, to put it mildly. In our book, the Film Factory, we have some very derogatory remarks about Boris Barnet's films. You know, somebody wrote, "What is this dog's dinner? Did it take 5 scriptwriters just to produce this?" Victor Shklovsky worked on the script, along with many other people. And but of course, one thing you realize if you read a lot of early Soviet film criticism, and actually late Soviet film criticism, is that Soviet film critics are ruthless in complaining. They very rarely write a positive review. So you can't go by those contemporary reviews. All the evidence is that Trubnaya and Girl with the Hat Box were actually very popular indeed. They actually answered to a desire, at least certainly on the part of the younger audience, for something that was distinctively of the present. And I just wanted to flag up, although I'm not going to go into this in detail, that another part of the landscape, of course, is what's happening in Petrograd becoming Leningrad. Because that, in many ways, is another story. And of course, one of the great themes that runs through so much Soviet-era art and culture is the rivalry between Moscow and Leningrad, and the sense that Leningrad always had of being, put down and ignored. And certainly Leningrad filmmakers always felt that they came off worst. They didn't really have the same profile. So we've been looking at Moscow filmmaking hitherto. But meanwhile, in Leningrad, the effects group, Kozintsev and Trauberg, this is an early book about them from, I think, 1928, 28 or early 29. They had emerged as a group, a collective, calling themselves the Factory of the Eccentric Actor. And that's one of the costume designs from one of their sort of multimedia stage shows. And that's still from their first film, The Adventures of Oktyabrina, which is lost. Nothing of it survives. We only have 2 or 3 stills, unfortunately. If we had The Adventures of Oktyabrina, from what we know about it, then we would have a whole other sort of pointer towards what Soviet cinema was trying to become. Because it's in the same vein as Miss Mend, in one sense, but actually it's much more fantastical. Oktyabrina is a sort of heroine of the revolution. She's a cliffhanger serial queen who, as you can see, does wonderful things and happens to wear a Red Army hat and a fetchingly short skirt. And she leaps around on various buildings with guns, etc., and she fulfills all the requirements of a better version of Pearl White and the serial queens of American cinema, which were so popular in Russia when they were available. So that's the kind of filmmaking that Kozintsev and Trauberg initiated up in Leningrad, and I'll show you something from their first longer film, which does survive, The Devil's Wheel. And I've put in a picture up there, since we are surrounded by Eisenstein, of young Sergei. This is Eisenstein himself, appearing in a very short film he made in 1923, which is an insert in one of his last stage productions, his travesty of Ostrovsky, Glumov, the little segment is called Glumov's Diary in Enough Simplicity for Every Wise Man. And what's interesting about it is that it shows us, it reminds us that Eisenstein came out of exactly the same milieu as Kozintsev and Trauberg, except in Moscow. He's one of these young men who's producing outrageous stage shows. He's thinking about film, just like they were. In fact, he thought about joining them at one point, as he wasn't making progress in Moscow, and there were very close relations in the mid-20s between Fex, Yutkevich, and Eisenstein. And here you sort of see him in that milieu in that film. You realize that everything is sort of trembling on the brink. Nobody has yet made a breakthrough of any kind in film. These are, on the whole, young men who are being kept at arm's length by the cinema industry, which is very uncertain about whether they have any part to play in it. And these are two other figures who are very much not part of our map, our usual map of the early Soviet cinema, but I think they should be, because we need to open it up a bit and actually kind of see something of its diversity. This is a poster for a film by young Friedrich Ermler. And Ermler would continue to be an important filmmaker right into the 40s. He's somebody who's been having a very considerable revaluation in recent years. There's been a whole cycle of retrospectives at the Bologna Cinema Ritrovato Festival, delving into areas of early Soviet cinema which were considered to be not interesting or not important. And so the programmers of these series, working with the Russian archive, have been holding up, excavating reputations of people that have been written off as boring, conformist filmmakers, and showing that they were nothing of the kind. And I think Ermler is a very good example of somebody who has suffered enormously from being seen as a kind of conformist figure. He was a party man. He was the only member of this whole generation who actually was a member of the party. He also is believed to have worked for the Cheka, to have been a Secret Service guy, though there was some dispute about that. And he was considered to be, a serious, well-connected, politically well-connected figure. And yet, he was making remarkable films in the mid-20s, which are actually about very acute questions of morality. The Parisian Cobbler, Katka's Ranette Apples. His first two films are about young communists behaving badly towards women. These are films that are very acute about gender issues. They're really raising difficult questions about communist morality, the kind of questions that Kollontai and others were talking about, which don't normally find their way into film at all, except in Ermler's work. And then he makes, at the end of the decade, he makes this extraordinary film, Fragment of an Empire, which I talked about here during the First World War series, which is a film about a soldier, as it were, who loses his memory on the Western Front, Eastern Front actually, and wakes up in the new world of Soviet Russia. It's a very interesting film which actually evokes the otherwise absent First World War and connects it with the emerging culture of the late 20s, of the Stalin period. And he goes on making important films during the 30s and into the 40s. So Ermler is somebody who needs to be really, I think, retrieved and brought back into focus. And this is Zhelyavsky. This is him at work, and I think I'll be able to show you a little extract from one of his early films, the Cigarette Girl from Muscle Prom, which is a street film, somewhat in the vein of Barnet's work. A film actually shot on the streets with real, recognizable people doing the kind of things that people were doing in 1923 and 24 in Moscow, which is very rare in the filmmaking of that time. And 2 or 3 of Giliabowski's films are absolutely terrific. I mean, they stand comparison with, let's say, new wave films from the French new wave of the late 50s and early 60s. They have that feel of liveliness, of contemporaneity. And one of the actors who appears for him, and is also in Protazanov's films, is, I've lost his name. You know who I mean? I have lost his name. Dear, dear. Carnival Night. Igor Ilyinsky. Sorry. Sometimes the synapses don't connect.
Which one is Igor Ilyinsky?
Sorry?
Which one is Igor Ilyinsky?
Which
picture is Igor Ilyinsky?
Ilyinsky. Yeah. He's in Cigarette Girl from Muscle Prom. And he's in all of Protazanov's films of the 1920s. He's really he's a joint invention of Giliabowski and especially Protazanov, who really kind of develops him as a major screen figure. He is the first great comedian of Soviet cinema, and he goes on being a great figure actually right into the 30s and into the 40s and even into the 50s. A very, very important figure, and somebody who really enabled these films of Protazanov's and Giliabowski's to connect with a popular audience. Very, very talented, very physical actor who became an absolute mainstay of the emerging Soviet cinema. Never, of course, appears in a film by Eisenstein or Pudovkin. So you begin to see the kind of separation, the gaps that are opening up. He belongs to a different camp. And just to finish, this is a very short slideshow. I'm going to show you some pieces of film. To deal with 2 other aspects which are often sort of out of sight, not brought into play, but I think we need a more complex view of this landscape than we have had normally. And this is really dealing with the Americanism that runs through the early and mid-20s. This is a film called The Kiss of Mary, Kiss of Mary Pickford, it's usually known as in English. And it's a film by Komarov, who was a member of the Kuleshov group. And it hinges on the fact that Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, the 2 most famous stars, married to each other of the era, did pay a visit to Moscow, were mobbed by their fans, and Komarov and members of the Kuleshov group had this brilliant idea of improvising a film around the fact that they visit the studio. So somebody rushes up and is kissed by Mary Pickford. And of course this really happens, as it were, in a staged setup. So it uses lots of shots of Pickford and Fairbanks, as they really did visit Moscow, but weaves them into a comedy. And of course it perfectly carries out the argument that montage cinema can bring together diverse elements and weld them into a kind of a new form of fiction, which has elements of reality, actual life caught unawares, as Vertov would have said, alongside elements of fiction and fantasy. And that, I think, is one of the very distinctive kinds of filmmaking of the mid-20s. The most famous example of that is a film known as Chess Fever, which I will show you a little bit of, which mixes elements of real footage of the chess champions coming to Moscow with an entirely invented comic frame. It's exactly the same principle as The Kiss of Mary Pickford. And this is a later Protazanov film, The White Eagle, from 1929, which is it's particularly interesting because it's the only performance by Meyerhold preserved on film. This is the Meyerhold, the great director, the great man of the theatre, who did make films. He made 2 films in the teens, but he was increasingly becoming persona non grata, and of course he would meet a horrible end, being arrested and executed. Eisenstein preserved his as Tatiana Gorieva reminded us the other night, Eisenstein preserved the Meyerhold archive. But Meyerhold, of course, was also in demand as an actor. He was a great actor, and he plays this Tsarist official in The White Eagle quite brilliantly. Now that's an important film because that belongs to the moment at the end in 28-29. It begins to be possible to make films that are set in pre-revolutionary times, which are not just caricatures. The White Eagle is actually about a governor who refuses to let the troops shoot on the workers. So it's one of those first steps towards acknowledging that not everything that happened before the revolution was bad and horrible. That film and a film called The 41st are two really crucial films just at the end of the 20s that mark a kind of change of attitude, the realization that you can make more sophisticated, less politically simplistic films. And there's Protazanov, the obvious man to do it, because he has experience in bridging these complicated situations. He's by far the most experienced dramatic filmmaker in Russia at this time. He'll go on to make some of the great literary adaptations in the 1930s. And he's still working right into the 40s when he dies. I think that Protazanov, I did a retrospective of Protazanov's films some years ago at the National Film Theatre and published a little book about him with Julian Graffi. And we felt then, I still feel that Protazanov really needs to be rescued from the kind of oblivion that he was cast into by people like Eisenstein. Because
Is that a silent film, yeah?
Sorry?
Is that a silent film?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Everything's silent up until 1930. Yeah. Yes, we don't hear Meyerhold speak. As far as I know, there's no preserved performance of his. I don't think. So, do stop me. So, Justine's setting a good example. Do stop me if there's anything you want me to enlarge on, because I might just blunder on. Okay. Yeah. Come on. Oops. Sorry. Right. So, that's a kind of sketch of the landscape. What I want to do is really show you some examples of some of what I've been talking about and maybe just say a little bit more about them. 1924 is the moment when a distinctively Soviet cinema begins to emerge. And having said that, there is a lot of production, of course, right from 1919 right through to 1924. And quite a lot of it survives. And I did a program of it at the Pordenone Festival about 8 or 9 or 10 years ago, which I have to say was a resounding flop. Nobody was interested. We showed them all these wonderful films that we'd found in the archives from 21 and 22 and 23. Did they want to see them? No. So the second part that we were scheduled to do has never happened. One of my favourites is a film called The Beauty and the Bolshevik. It's a terrific film by Razumny. Marvellous film. It's a really great film. It was released in the States. That's why it has that title. It's called Kombrig Ivanov. But it didn't catch fire. I mean, that's a problem with the modern Western audience, I have to say. So 1924 effectively is the period. I'm going to turn the Wi-Fi off, otherwise those things will keep interfering. My emails will keep coming in. 24 is really when the first signs of a popular, distinctively Soviet cinema begins to actually reach the screen. And there are two examples of that, one of which I'm going to show you. One is the film by Perestiani called Red Imps or Little Red Devils. It's got various sort of Western titles. And that's a Civil War story, which shows a gang of kids who are sort of riding with the Red Army, with the Red Cavalry, in fact, and generally getting involved in daring-do adventures during the Civil War. And it's set in Georgia, and Perestyani had been quite a notable actor in the pre-revolutionary cinema. And he's one of these people, he appears in lots of films by Yevgeny Bauer and people like that, but he turned to direction. And it's he who actually gives Soviet cinema its first Western, if you like, its first action film. Full of fun, full of action, full of gimmicks, a very, very popular film. The other film of that year, 24, is The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks, the film with the longest title in cinema history. Made by Lev Kuleshov. Kuleshov had, of course, also worked in pre-revolutionary cinema. He'd been an art director for Bauer, and he's the key transitional figure who makes a transition from the late pre-revolutionary cinema through the hard years of the Civil War to making films with no stock, no money, no nothing, to setting up a kind of collective, a sort of film school, the Kuleshov Group, the famous experiments that he carries out in montage, as it were, by splicing together pieces of film. But then the challenge is, can he make a film that will actually bring in a paying audience? And that's what he does with The Extraordinary Adventures. And The Extraordinary Adventures is a very well-calculated film, which captures that popular enthusiasm for detective fiction, cliffhanger serials, things of that sort. It's a joke. Mr. West has come from New York, from the YMCA, we're told, to Moscow to find out for himself about these dreadful Bolsheviks he's heard about. Are they really as bad as he's heard? And he's captured by a bunch of hoodlums, led by Pudovkin as an actor, who kidnap him and put on a series of shows to convince him that the Bolsheviks really are terrible, until he's rescued by a real Bolshevik. And he brings with him his faithful servant, Cowboy Jedi, who is played by Boris Barnet. And hopefully, this is what you will now see. So, yes, that really is Barnet, who had been a boxer, amongst other things, and was very athletic, and of course did his own stunts. And you can see that that part of the film, and much of the film, is very explicitly, it's not exactly a homage to, but it's a sort of tongue-in-cheek parody of popular action films from America. It's saying, we can do this kind of thing. What if this was set amongst familiar buildings, streets, monuments of Moscow, instead of it always being imported from the States? It plays to a real enthusiasm for popular American cinema, which was certainly rife across the whole Russian public at this time. But it's also, Kuleshov wrote several articles in the early 20s on Americanism, as he called it, really saying we should study American cinema. American cinema has a great deal to teach us. Its economy, its transitivity, the way that it really speaks proper film language. So Kuleshov becomes one of those figures who attacks traditional patterns of Russian filmmaking, which are quite static, quite slow, and says, no, Russian cinema, the new Russian cinema, should be more like American cinema, certainly in its film language. And this is a demonstration piece. So that's why its theme is so obviously, borrowing American tropes.
Ian, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So just this whole interest in the United States. So even Eisenstein is drawing Jack London.
Yeah, sure.
So what is that? Is that worldwide? Is that only in Russia? Is that a European thing?
Well, I think it's worldwide, but I think it has a particular intensity in Russia. I think the desire to modernize Russia is an aspect of the early post-revolutionary period that we slightly tend to forget about. Modernization is very much in people's minds. How to be modern. And America, of course, was seen as the beacon of modernity. And so there are lots of performances, not just in film, but there's a famous ballet called Our Ford. There are all sorts of things that ape American sort of production lines. Look at Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky finally gets to New York and he writes a sort of poem in praise of Brooklyn Bridge. Any Russian, any early Soviet Russian who could get to America came back telling tales of wonder and saying we should be more like America. And interestingly, as you know, I was just reading, we just, as part of the research for the Eisenstein exhibition, we discovered really that Eisenstein attended the debate in the House of Commons on November the 5th, 1929, when he came to London, the day after he arrived probably. And that's a debate about whether Britain should resume relations with Soviet Russia, which had broken off in 1926. Long debate, huge debate, lasted until 10 o'clock at night, went on all day, everybody spoke. And one of the themes that comes from this debate is America didn't break off relations with Russia. Everybody in Russia loves America. They've been sending famine relief. Britain is regarded as a bad object in Russia because of this standoffish attitude of boycotting Russia. But the theme is America has not boycotted, and as a result, relations between America and Russia are excellent. Speaker after speaker says that in 1929. So there was no sense of that was taboo. No, it was learn from. That's one of the slogans, of course, that Stalin brought in, learn from and then overtake America. So yeah, there was absolutely no taboo at this stage in doing that. And the taboo, such as it is, would come much later. So obviously, we should go to A Cigarette Girl. If I can find... hang on. Yep, found it. Ooh, that's good. Let's have a look at just a little bit of The Cigarette Girl from Muscle Prom, just to give you a sense of Zhelyabuski's, what I've called street wise cinema. I might just dive into it a little bit rather than... Now let me just say, this is made by a studio called Mezhrapom Rus. And I haven't talked about studios, but we can come back to that later. Mezhrapom Rus was a new composite studio that was set up in the early 20s. Rus is the Russian part of it, is an original pre-revolutionary studio which continued. Mezhrapom was the international workers' relief organization set up in Germany to raise money to alleviate famine, actually, in Russia and other things. And they formed a joint company with Rus. And most of the, I would say, interesting films, other than Pudovkin and Eisenstein, of the 20s were made by Mezhrapom Rus. They managed to fuse aspects of pre-revolutionary expertise with a real sense of making popular films which would reach out to an audience. Now we're just introducing all the characters here. We might need to just... There we see Ilinsky, for the, much less podgy than he would appear in most of his later appearances. We see him as a young man. I'm sorry, this doesn't have titles. And all I want to do is give you a feel for how it captures the texture and the rhythm of daily life. There's a lot of setting up going on. I'm going to jump a little bit here because this is going to be a little too slow. So we're filming in the street. It didn't all start with a man with a movie camera. And of course there are rich people and not so rich people, because this is the NEP, this is the NEP period, 24. So there are real differences, as it were, on show. I'll just talk over it if you don't mind, just for the sake of speed. Kovalov made a very interesting film back in the 90s, part of a series of films commemorating the centenary of cinema. And Silyanov and Kovalov made this film. They made, as it were, the beginnings of Russian cinema, an overview film. And their theme is that daily life, ordinary life, simply does not appear in Soviet cinema. It's erased from the screen. And they trace the process of its erasure. By the time we reach the end of the 20s, there is no such thing as ordinary life on the screen. Soviet cinema has been purged of that and has become this stylized, artificial creation. But there is a period in the early 20s when there's a lot of daily life, street life. And this is why Zhelebusky's couple of films are really, here we have The Cigarette Girl from Muscle Problem, who is in fact Yulia Soltseva, who is the star of Aelita as well. Future Mrs. Dovzhenko. And just to see that kind of street full of people crisscrossing and passing by, I mean, if you've seen many Soviet films of the 20s, you will never have seen that, because it just doesn't happen in any other films. It's a very, very rare sight, a sense of bustle in the streets. And we know, I think, that it's not been set up. We know that this is a film made on the hoof, as it were, in the street. I think it's something very precious and very interesting. You only get to see fragments, I'm afraid. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. But you can find that very easily if you want to have a look at it at length. And I would strongly recommend it, The Cigarette Girl from Moskvadrom. We shouldn't have a look at a little bit of Aelita, because not everybody will know Aelita, I'm sure. Maybe nobody will know it, even though it has become increasingly popular. So this is a better quality image, although it's got strange subtitles. But that doesn't matter. We're not here to read the text. I want to show you the beginning of the film. So Aelita begins in a radio station, Moscow radio station, with the engineers and scientists standing around, making jokes about messages from Mars. And one of them, the rather soulful one, engineer Loss, believes he's been getting messages from Mars. And this is his wife. He's phoning up to find out what he's up to. Now, in fact, these two characters, Los and Spiridonov, are being played by the same actor, which is why they never quite appear in the same frame together. This is rather important for the plot of the film. I won't spoil it for you. The actor is a very interesting one. Who had been one of the stars of the Kamenny Theatre. And so what you get in this is a very interesting kind of mixture of acting styles. He's kind of serious actor. But again, what I value about this aspect of Aelita is this tremendous sense of recreation. It's actually quite a historically sensitive film. It's made in 24. So we get street life and we get the extraordinary sets for the Martian fantasy. And Alexandra Exter's wonderful costumes. And one of the great actors of pre-revolutionary Russian cinema, Konstantin Igor, who also appeared in the Kamenny Theatre and elsewhere, who plays the King of Mars. And his apparatchiks have constructed this amazing machine which allows them to view what's happening on Earth. And of course, for all the world, it's like a little sort of Garbo sculpture being animated in front of your eyes. But what's so interesting about the film is the way it uses elements of a lot of avant-garde styles. There are at least 2 or 3 or 4 different avant-garde styles, all being fused together very cleverly. There is an art director, Kozlovsky, who's the head in charge of art direction at Metropolis, who is somehow, in the way that art directors do, fusing together all of these different elements very skillfully. This is really the first time that anybody has attempted in Russian filmmaking, forget the question of the revolution, nobody has yet made a science fiction film in Russian production up to this point. So that, of course, explains why they decided to go for this as a prestige project. It was expensive, time-consuming, prestigious, and by and large, it fulfilled all of those ambitions. But it also includes, very interestingly, a little foretaste of the future, because basically what Aelita, when she is left to her own devices, is able to use the machine through which you can view Earth to have a look for herself. And what we see, of course, is a variety of scenes montaged together, a sort of kaleidoscopic view of what's happening on Earth. This, in a way, anticipates what it's amazing how often that scene turns up. You just see it in Mr. West. Twice in the same year we're at that vantage point. Very convenient, obviously known to filmmakers. Los and his wife, locked in an embrace. But Los is hankering after his imagined relationship with the Princess of Mars. And Princesses of Mars were very popular at this time. Edgar Rice Burroughs, great cycle of novels, Princess of Mars, in America. So there's nothing particularly Russian about this. In fact, what it's doing is Russian popular culture is kind of catching up with what is already mainstream in American popular culture, in Edgar Rice Burroughs novels. Los's wife is at the sink, making do in the very difficult conditions of life in 1921 and 22, when everything is in short supply. So anyway, I've already given you a view about this. Los, the dreamer, and Spiridonov, his counterpart, are both, they have a fantasy, or a plan, to build a rocket which will allow them to reach Mars. And the film is about the denouement of that fantasy. Okay. I think what I should do is show you a little bit of sorry, I'm just can't see it here, of chest fever. If I can find it. I know it's there somewhere. Can anybody see chest fever? I can't see. Sure, it's there somewhere. Put it there. Oh dear. Oh well. Maybe not. Chest Fever is probably, of all this period, the film that you're most likely to have seen. So we won't stop, I won't say anything more about it, except that it does fuse elements of real footage shot during an international chess competition in Moscow, with the reigning champions of chess, with wonderfully comic performance by Vladimir Fogel, who was one of the great comic actors of this period, who appears in Barnet's films and in Protazanov's films, and who sadly committed suicide at the end of the 20s, but who was one of the extraordinary acting talents.
Pudovkin's there.
Yeah, Pudovkin's there, but that's different. That's the end of that's the mother.
No, mother's above.
Sorry?
Mother's above that one there. Mother is above that.
Oh.
It goes Martin, Miss Men, the girl with the New Babylon, and then underneath that Pudovkin might be Chess Fever.
Yeah, but that's.
Chess Fever.
Oh, it is. You're absolutely right. Well done. Sorry, I couldn't. I have this problem when I've got a long list of. Sorry. Yes, thank you. Let's have a little look at it a bit. I just want to see a bit of Fogel's performance as the demented chess fiend, which is really rather wonderful. Everybody who was anybody appears in this film or has a hand in it. All sorts of people join in, and Capablanca appears as himself, as it were. Fogel. Fogel is a chess fanatic who can't bear to be parted from his chess pieces, even to get married. So we have some real footage, snatched, as it were, and that's the real footage, real chess champions, real audience. And this is Fogel at home. Chess dominates his life. Wonderful figure. He's appears in Barnet's greatest films. And I've got a page in the Film Factory book that Richard Taylor and I did. We have a page of stills of Fogel, which was actually given to me by Leonid Trauberg's wife. She told me a lot about him, what a wonderful guy he was. You can see that kind of desire to emulate American physical comedy, very strong at the time. This film was actually made by a group. Shpikovsky, another unknown figure, actually directed it and wrote it. Pudovkin was involved in it, and other directors and film people all got together. So it's kind of group effort. His fiancée is not happy. Right, you've seen enough. We've got to move on, I'm afraid. There are about 4 more extracts I'd like to show you, just to give you some sort of sense. I'm trying to keep an eye on the time here. So I think where we go next is to a little bit of Miss Mend. And this is a short extract from Miss Mend, which has recently been, fairly recently been reissued in the States, issued in a rather nice copy. A lot of good restoration, which just gives you a sense of the quality that could be achieved at this time. This is Barnet directing his first film, co-directing his first film with Otsep, two young guys cutting their teeth in this adaptation of Jim Dollar's saga of Miss Mend. It's about two detectives who are on the trail of a poison gas manufacturer. Clearly very influenced by Fantômas and French serial culture, which had been such an influence in the teens. Eisenstein was a big Fantômas enthusiast, and so those films of Fantômas, Judex, etc., which had been pouring in from France in the teens, are the sort of seedbed of this new attempt to produce a Soviet-Russian equivalent. Poison gas is a staple feature of Fantômas style serial culture. You find lots of it going back 10 years or so earlier than this. So in a sense this is Russian cinema catching up with what many of these filmmakers have grown up with as youngsters. So that's a little bit of Miss Mend, again a big popular hit for Barnet and Otsep. And I want to show you now a little bit of the Devil's Wheel, if I can find it.
One at the bottom.
It is. You're quite right. It is. Thank you. Now, this is the first feature-length film by Kozintsev and Trauberg, the FEX group in Leningrad. And it was a very big success, especially with young people. I had the pleasure of knowing Leonid Trauberg for the part of his life. And it's very much a film which was addressed to young people. And the idea is a sailor from the Aurora who has got shore leave. He comes ashore to have a good time, as sailors do. The feature of the film is the pleasure it takes in showing the kind of low life of Leningrad. This was Kozintsev and Trauberg's great interest and enthusiasm at this time. So what they do is to create a kind of portrait of, people doing all the things you're not supposed to be doing. Bars, prostitution, low life. And for this they recruited an amazing array of actors with all sorts of talents. They even have a black actor. First time I think we ever see a black actor in a Western film who was a member of their group. And Mr. Question Mark, a fairground entertainer who's played by a figure who will become one of the boss figures in Soviet cinema. Lyudmila Semyonova, one of their key actresses, who plays the girl that the sailor picks up when they go out on the land, as it were, in the fairground. So again, this is a film which is trying to evoke the kind of things that young people might dream of doing. The dancer on the rope there, I think, is the woman who would become Mrs. Trauberg. She'd been a circus dancer. Pretty sure that's her. Again, if you remember that image of Eisenstein with the posters behind him from Blumov's diary, here we're getting exactly the sort of same sense of how the walls of Moscow and Leningrad were actually plastered with posters for different kinds of entertainment at this time. And this is the Luna Park, the fun fair, which is the central location for the film. Wonderful film. Very interesting film. This kind of the very idea that this is a sailor from the Aurora who is leading a different kind of life, a typical sort of sailor's shore life, is playing with notions of revolutionary rectitude, as it were. Now, again, I would encourage you to look further at it. Kozintsev and Trauberg, of course, would become themselves pillars of socialist realism when they made the Youth of Maxim in the 1930s. But their career as the FEX group, from Oktyabrina through to New Babylon in 1929, is an extraordinary kind of carnival of trying out all sorts, inventing new styles of filmmaking, which are only possible in that sort of short period. I think time is beginning to close in on me, and I'm just wondering how much more I can show you. I mean, and well, let me just show you a little bit of Katka's Rhinette Apples. This is the film by Ermler, because Ermler is probably somebody you haven't come across. I'll just turn the sound down a little bit. And again, what you see in the early Ermler is a real sort of feeling for showing ordinary life, as it were. So Katka's selling Rhinette apples from a tray, just like the cigarette girl from Muscle Prom, very much a kind of feature of street life in this period. That's a poster for Patterson, who was a popular comedian, a Danish comedian. His films circulated very widely. Fyodor Nikitin, the great actor who was so closely associated with Ermler, he plays the shell-shocked soldier in Fragment of an Empire, an extraordinary actor who appears in all of Ermler's early films. Okay, I'm afraid to stop there. So maybe the best thing I can do at this stage is to just show you a little bit of the New Babylon, which is really the climax. Well, no, let's see. I think we can do Girl with the Hat Box. You really need to see a little bit more of Barnet as he emerges and finds his distinctive style of knowing comedy. So this is the Girl with the Hat Box, and this is Vogel, Vladimir Vogel again, key actor, who is, this extract is called the coup de foudre. This is Vogel being thunderstruck by the appearance of Anna Sten, who is the girl with the hat box, who's taking a hat box into town. She makes hats for a living. Right. So that's him running vainly after Anna Sten. And if you wanted, just to give you a sense of how the other great comedy by Barnet, The House on Trubnaya, made about the same time. This is Moscow waking up, a tenement building. And the character that Vogel plays in this is Golikov, who is a hairdresser, a barber, much bullied by his wife, who has pretensions. So a scene of anarchy on the communal staircase as everybody goes about their business. And this is setting the scene for the arrival of a young woman who is coming to Moscow from out of town. Now I'm going to jump a little bit, I hope, and show you what happens. This is the chauffeur who lives in the same building. Again, we get an interesting kind of unvarnished view of the fabric of Moscow and of the look of the streets, and unrehearsed scenes of passers-by on the sidewalk. This is really quite late. This is 27, 28. And there's a tremendous delight in showing it. This is much more kind of artfully composed and constructed than we saw in the Cigarette Girl from Muscle Prom. This is the girl who's come in from the provinces, just arrived in Moscow, trying to find her way. What this says, is roughly, but we've forgotten to tell you how she got to Moscow. A little explanation, the letter, etc. I wanted to show you that sequence. I think it's one of the greatest sequences in early Barnet. This is absolutely a fantastic film. A film that was much, as I think I said earlier, much derided by critics of the period who thought it was a kind of jumble. So many people contributed to the script, but actually, of course, it's a very good example of Barnet as the shaping figure. I mean, I've been referring to all of these films as if the directors are the only key people, which is definitely not the case. But certainly in Barnet's case, getting this mass of script material, he's clearly the guiding intelligence who puts it all together and gives it real filmic shape. And this, just in the few years that you've seen from 24 up to this film, 28 or so, you see a tremendous sophistication in how to put a comedy of manners together. I think in The House on Trubnaya and in The Girl with the Hat Box. These are very sophisticated films that really capture the feel of life in Soviet Russia, just on the brink of the imposition of Stalin's socialist realism and the drive of the first 5-year plan and so forth. And people like Barnet would be pushed to one side and forced to find other genres that they could work in when this happened. Interestingly, when the first books were written about Soviet cinema, the very first modern book about Soviet cinema by Thorold Dickinson and Catherine de la Roche, called Soviet Cinema, published in 47, 48, refers to a few insignificant filmmakers. Most of it is devoted to Eisenstein and Pudovkin, a little bit of Vertov, and then it says there were a few other filmmakers, including Boris Barnet, who was just a typical example of somebody who just joined the pieces as they come. Join the pieces as they come. You've just seen one of Barnet's exquisite little passages. And this is written by Thorold Dickinson, a filmmaker himself. Nobody had seen these films, of course, since the 20s or the 30s at best, and they had no status, no reputation, no nothing. And excavating the reputation of Barnet and of some of these other filmmakers that I've been mentioning is it's a long process. There was a Barnet retrospective about 20 years ago, and Barnet's name has now advanced up the records, as it were, but he's still a very little known figure to the wider public. And the thought I'd like to leave you with is that there's an awful lot more Soviet cinema of the 20s and of the 30s and of the 50s that still needs to be rediscovered. And the problem with our fetishization of Eisenstein, really, and Vertov, is that they just tend to loom too large. They obscure all the others. And it's very difficult to find a sort of a platform from which we can actually look dispassionately and recognize their genius, certainly, but at the same time recognise the brilliance of some of these other filmmakers. I've talked for too long, sorry.
Thank you so much.